The city lights below stretched endlessly, each window a story, each street a secret. Clara Whitmore pressed her palm against the cold glass of the penthouse window, her wedding ring catching the moonlight. The Manhattan skyline had once promised her everything: love, security, a life beyond her wildest dreams. Now those same lights seemed to mock her naivety. "I thought I had married into a fairy tale," she whispered to her reflection, her breath fogging the glass, "until I uncovered a truth so powerful it nearly destroyed us." The silence in the apartment was deafening. Marcus was at another late meeting, or so he claimed. 3 months ago she would have believed him without question. 3 months ago she hadn't known about the encrypted files, the offshore accounts, or the name that changed everything: Project Eden. Her phone buzzed on the marble countertop. Another message from an unknown number. "T'd stop digging or lose everything." Clara's fingers trembled as she deleted it. The threats had started 2 weeks ago, right after she'd stumbled upon the first document. She'd been looking for their insurance papers in Marcus's home office when she found it, a single folder marked P Confidential. What she discovered inside had shattered every illusion about the man she'd married. The billionaire CEO, who'd swept her off her feet, who'd promised her the world, was orchestrating something that could destroy thousands of lives. The elevator chimed softly. Marcus was home. Clara straightened her shoulders, schooling her features into the mask she'd perfected over the past weeks. Tonight, she would finally confront him. Tonight, everything will change. The woman who married a billionaire CEO was me, but what I discovered could have destroyed not only my marriage, but his empire. My name is Clara Whitmore, and 6 months ago, I was just another financial analyst working 80-hour weeks in a cramped Manhattan office. Today, I'm standing in a $40 million penthouse, holding evidence that could bring down one of the most powerful men in America. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply that you'd stake your life on their honesty? Have you ever looked into the eyes of the person you love and wondered if everything they've told was a carefully constructed lie? That's where I found myself 3 months into my marriage to Marcus Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Industries and the man Forbes called the golden touch of Wall Street. They say love is blind, but I learned that sometimes blindness is a choice. We choose not to see the late-night phone calls, the locked doors, the conversations that stop when we enter the room. We choose to believe the explanations because the alternative, that the person we've given our heart to might be capable of something terrible, is too painful to consider. But when the evidence becomes impossible to ignore, when you stumble upon something that makes your blood run cold, you face a choice that will define the rest of your life. The secret had a name: Project Eden. At first glance it seemed like another one of Marcus's humanitarian ventures, a massive agricultural initiative aimed at solving world hunger. The press releases painted a beautiful picture: sustainable farming technology that could feed millions, backed by Whitmore Industries' billions. But the documents I found told a different story. Hidden beneath layers of shell companies and encrypted communications was the truth. Project Eden wasn't about feeding the hungry, it was about controlling the food supply of entire nations. The technology Marcus was developing could remotely destroy crops, creating artificial famines that would force governments to their knees. The humanitarian angle? A perfect cover for what was essentially economic warfare. The night I discovered this, I sat on our bathroom floor shaking. The man I'd married, who held me when I cried about world suffering, who donated millions to charity galas we attended together, he was planning to weaponize hunger itself. But here's what made it worse. I wasn't just his wife, I was his alibi. Every charity event we attended, every photo op of us at refugee camps, every interview where he spoke passionately about ending world hunger with me by his side, I had been unknowingly helping him build the perfect facade. The evidence was overwhelming. Contracts with defense departments, meetings with arms dealers disguised as agricultural consultants, test runs in small villages that had resulted in crop failures blamed on climate change. And at the center of it all, my husband's signature on every authorization. Stay with me until the end, because what I discovered may change how you see love, money, and trust forever. This isn't just a story about corporate greed or marital betrayal. It's about the price of truth and the cost of silence. It's about what happens when you must choose between the life you've built and the lives of strangers halfway across the world. Over the next few minutes, I'll take you inside a world where billion-dollar deals are made over champagne, toasts, while millions face starvation. Where love becomes a weapon and trust becomes a liability. Where a woman who thought she'd found her happily ever after must decide if she'll be complicit in a crime against humanity or risk everything to stop it. You'll discover how I gathered evidence while pretending to be the perfect billionaire's wife. How I navigated a world of private jets and private investigators, where every smile could hide a threat and every friend could be an enemy. And ultimately, how I made a choice that would either save countless lives or destroy the only man I'd ever loved. Before we continue, if you're already hooked and want to hear how this shocking story unfolds, smash that subscribe button right now and join the Rich Billionaire Romance Stories family. We share the most captivating tales of love, betrayal, and redemption every single week. Hit the notification bell so you never miss another heart-stopping story. And if you believe love should conquer greed, not enable it, give this video a thumbs up. Your support helps more people discover these incredible true stories. 6 months before I stood in that penthouse contemplating my husband's betrayal, I was Clara Mitchell, not Whitmore, rushing through the rain-soaked streets of Manhattan with a broken umbrella and a calculator that wouldn't stop running numbers in my head. My tiny studio apartment in Queens was a 45-minute subway ride from the financial district where I worked as a junior analyst at Brennan & Associates. The firm was respectable but not prestigious, the kind of place where you earned your stripes through endless spreadsheets and forgotten weekends. My salary barely covered rent and student loans, but I was proud of every dollar I'd earned honestly. My father had been a high school math teacher who believed wealth meant having enough to share with others. My mother, a nurse who worked double shifts, taught me that integrity was the only currency that truly mattered. They'd passed away in a car accident during my final year of college, leaving me with their values and a determination to make them proud. That Tuesday morning started like any other. My alarm failed to go off, the subway was delayed, and my boss had already sent 3 emails about the Henderson portfolio before I'd even reached the office. I was soaked, exhausted, and clutching a coffee I couldn't really afford when I pushed through the revolving doors of our building. The elevator was packed. I squeezed in, trying not to drip on anyone's expensive shoes when someone said, "Rough morning?" I looked up to find the most striking gray eyes I'd ever seen, belonging to a man who somehow made a $1,000 suit look casual. "The umbrella gave up at 42nd Street, I replied, attempting to wring water from my hair without seeming too disheveled, though I think it was planning its escape since last Tuesday. He smiled, not the polite dismissive smile I was used to from the building's wealthier occupants, but something genuine that reached those remarkable eyes. Umbrellas in New York have a life expectancy of about 3 storms. You got good mileage. The elevator lurched to a stop between floors. The lights flickered, and several people groaned. "Perfect. Just perfect. Buildings older than they look," he said conversationally, seemingly unbothered by our predicament. "They've been meaning to update these elevators for years." "Do you work here often?" I asked, then immediately felt foolish. Of course he did. Nobody wore suits that expensive without having an office in a building like this. "Sometimes I'm actually looking for Brennan & Associates. The meeting got moved last minute, and I'm embarrassingly lost." 14th floor, I said automatically. "That's where I stopped, suddenly realizing. "Wait, are you at 9 a.m. with Henderson Industries?" His eyebrows rose slightly. "Marcus Whitmore. And you must be the junior analyst who's been living in those spreadsheets for the past 2 weeks. I finished. "Clara Mitchell. I've been preparing your preliminary reports. The ones that actually make sense? He sounded genuinely impressed. My team's been raving about them, said whoever did them understood the numbers and the people behind them. The elevator shuddered back to life, and we began moving again. In the fluorescent light I noticed he looked tired despite his polished appearance, as if he'd been carrying more than just business concerns. When we reached the 14th floor, I expected him to stride ahead to the conference room. Instead, he paused. "You're soaked," he observed. "The meeting's not for another 20 minutes. There's a coffee shop on the 2nd floor that has those hand dryers in the bathroom. Might help?" I stared at him. "You're suggesting I go dry off when you have $1 million meeting in 20 minutes? I'm suggesting that people matter more than meetings," he said simply. "Besides, I'd like the analyst who understands my company to be comfortable while she presents her findings." It was such a small gesture, but something in his tone made my throat tight. In a world where I was usually invisible, just another cog in the financial machine, he saw me as a person. "I have a better idea," I said, surprising myself with my boldness. "There's a break room on our floor with paper towels and mediocre coffee. You could review the report somewhere quiet before facing the boardroom sharks." He laughed, a rich, genuine sound that transformed his face. "Boardroom sharks. That's accurate. Lead the way, Clara Mitchell." As we walked down the hallway, I noticed he matched his pace to mine, not the usual power walk of executives who expected others to keep up. When we passed the senior partner's offices, he didn't angle for visibility or recognition. He simply walked beside me, asking thoughtful questions about the analysis. In the break room, I handed him a stack of paper towels. "For your shoes. The rain got everyone today." He looked down at his Italian leather shoes, then at my completely soaked flats, and did something unexpected. He handed the towels back to me. "You first. I'm not the one with the $1 million meeting," I protested. "No," he agreed. "You're the one who made it possible." As I dried off, he studied the reports I'd prepared, occasionally asking questions that showed he'd actually read every detail. Not just the summary, not just the bottom line. Everything. "You caught the discrepancy in their third-quarter projections," he said, looking up. "My own team missed that." "Numbers tell stories," I said, warming to my favorite subject. "You just have to know how to listen. And what story do these numbers tell you?" I hesitated, then decided on honesty. That Henderson Industries is hiding something in their supply chain. The math doesn't add up unless they're sourcing from somewhere they don't want to disclose. His eyes sharpened, and for a moment, I saw the billionaire CEO everyone wrote about. Brilliant, intense, formidable. Then he smiled, and he was just Marcus again. "You're absolutely right, and you're the first person brave enough to put it in writing." He stood, straightening his tie. "How would you like to present these findings yourself?" My heart skipped. "In the boardroom? But I'm just the analyst who sees what others miss," he finished. That moment in the break room, with coffee-stained counters and flickering lights, changed everything. He wasn't just offering me a chance to present. He was offering me a chance to be seen, to matter, to step out of the shadows where I'd been hiding since my parents died. "Yes," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I'll do it." His smile widened. "Brilliant. Though you might want to borrow my jacket. It's dry, and those boardroom sharks respect armor." As he shrugged off his suit jacket and handed it to me, our fingers brushed. The touch was brief, professional, but something electric passed between us. At that moment, I think we both knew this was bigger than a business meeting. Do you believe fate brings the right people together at the strangest times? Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever met someone who changed your life in an unexpected moment. Because looking back, I realized that the flooded elevator wasn't a coincidence. It was destiny dressed in rain and broken umbrellas. But destiny, I would learn, has a twisted sense of humor. The man who saw me when I was invisible would one day make me wish I could disappear entirely. The Henderson Industries presentation went better than I'd ever dreamed. Marcus had introduced me as the analyst who sees beyond the numbers, and for the first time in my career, I felt like I belonged in that boardroom. When the meeting ended, I expected him to disappear back into his world of private jets and corner offices. Instead, he waited for me by the elevators. "Coffee?" he asked simply. To celebrate not getting eaten by sharks. That coffee turned into 2 hours at a small cafe 3 blocks away, the kind of place where the barista knew everyone's order and the tables wobbled slightly. Marcus seemed completely at ease, asking about my background, my dreams, my thoughts on everything from market trends to favorite books. "You don't seem like a billionaire," I said, immediately regretting my bluntness. He laughed. "What do billionaires seem like? Less interested in whether I prefer Austen or Dickens. For the record, which do you prefer?" "Austen." She understood that money doesn't guarantee happiness, but it certainly complicates love. Something shifted in his expression. Wise woman. The next week he texted me about a market analysis question, then another coffee, then lunch at a deli where he insisted on splitting the check despite my protests. Each meeting felt natural, unforced. 2 people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. He never mentioned his wealth, never name-dropped or showed off. When I talked about my student loans, he listened without offering to solve my problems. When I mentioned missing my parents, he shared stories about losing his own father young. For 6 weeks, Marcus Whitmore was just Marcus. Thoughtful, funny, surprisingly down-to-earth. The revelation came accidentally. I was grabbing lunch near my office when I saw his face on the cover of Forbes magazine at a newsstand. The Golden Touch of Wall Street, how Marcus Whitmore built a billion-dollar empire. I stared at the cover, my sandwich forgotten. The man in the photograph wore the same gray eyes and genuine smile I'd come to know, but everything else was different. The setting was a gleaming boardroom. The suit probably cost more than my monthly salary. The headline called him one of the most influential CEOs under 40. My hands shook as I bought the magazine and read it in a nearby park. Whitmore Industries wasn't just successful. It was a global powerhouse with interests in technology, agriculture, and defense contracting. Marcus wasn't just wealthy, he was Forbes list, private island, changed the world with a phone call wealthy. The article mentioned his penthouse overlooking Central Park, his collection of vintage cars, his reputation for closing deals worth hundreds of millions. There were photos of him at charity galas with celebrities, at business summits with world leaders, at exclusive events I'd only read about in gossip magazines. This was the man who'd spent an hour last Tuesday helping me debug a spreadsheet formula, who'd listened patiently while I worried about making rent, who'd insisted on walking me to the subway because it was getting dark. When he texted that evening asking about dinner, I stared at my phone for 20 minutes before responding. How do you tell someone you've discovered they're not who you thought they were? How do you admit you've been completely naive about the person you're falling for? I saw the Forbes article, I finally typed. His response came immediately. "Can we talk?" We met at our usual cafe, but everything felt different. I kept glancing around, wondering if paparazzi were hiding behind newspapers, if other customers recognized him. Marcus seemed to sense my discomfort. "I should have told you sooner," he said quietly. I liked being Marcus with you. Not the CEO, not the billionaire. Just me." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee absently. "Because, when people know who I am, they change. They want something from me, or they're intimidated, or they start performing instead of just being themselves. You never did any of that. Because I didn't know." "Exactly." He looked up, and I saw vulnerability I'd never noticed before. "Clara, these past 2 months have been the most real I've felt in years. You see me, not my bank account, not my company, just me. That's incredibly rare." I wanted to be angry about the deception, but looking at him, I understood. In a world where his wealth defined every interaction, I'd been the one person who'd simply seen Marcus. "So what happens now?" I asked. He reached across the table and took my hand. "Now I ask if you'd like to find out what real looks like when it comes with complications." It wasn't a traditional proposal, but somehow it was perfect. Honest, unvarnished, and completely him. "Yes," I said, "but I'm keeping my apartment for a while." He smiled. "I wouldn't expect anything less." The engagement lasted 3 months, but it felt like 3 years compressed into a beautiful, overwhelming blur. Marcus insisted on keeping things simple, but his version still involved a private jet to Paris for dinner and a ring that required its own insurance policy. The wedding was intimate, 50 guests in a garden overlooking the Hudson River. I wore my grandmother's pearls and a dress that cost more than my previous year's salary. Marcus's vows were simple. "You saw me when I was invisible to myself. I promise to see you just as clearly, always." The honeymoon in Tuscany was magical, but returning to New York meant entering Marcus's world completely. The penthouse was stunning, floor-to-ceiling windows, museum-quality art, a kitchen that belonged in a 5-star restaurant. But it was also intimidating. Everything was perfect, expensive, untouchable. "Make it yours," Marcus said, finding me standing uncertainly in the living room. "Change whatever you want. This is our home now." The lifestyle took adjustment. Dinners at restaurants where reservations were booked months in advance. Charity galas where my dress cost more than most people's cars. A personal shopper who seemed to know my measurements better than I did. A driver who appeared whenever I needed to go anywhere. Marcus tried to ease the transition. He'd cook breakfast in our restaurant-quality kitchen, insisting on making my coffee himself. He'd dismiss the driver and walk with me through Central Park, pointing out his favorite spots. He'd curl up with me on our ridiculously expensive sofa to watch old movies, making popcorn in bowls that probably belonged in a museum. "You're adapting beautifully," he said one evening as we watched the sunset from our terrace. "Am I?" I asked. "Sometimes I feel like I'm playing dress-up in someone else's life." "It's your life now too," he said, pulling me closer. "We'll figure it out together." But even then, I noticed things that didn't quite fit. The paparazzi discovered us 3 weeks after the wedding. Suddenly, our private dinners became front-page photos. Our casual walks became exclusive sightings. Marcus handled it with practiced ease, but I felt exposed, analyzed, judged by strangers who knew nothing about us. "Mrs. Whitmore, how does it feel to marry into billions?" a reporter shouted as we left a restaurant. "Like winning the lottery," I replied automatically, then immediately regretted the flippant response. The headline the next day read, "Billionaire's wife, like winning the lottery." The article painted me as a gold digger who'd struck it rich. Marcus was furious, but I was devastated. "They don't know you," he said, holding me as I cried over the breakfast table. "They don't know us." But the attention was relentless. Photos of me shopping, working out, even grabbing coffee became tabloid fodder. Clara's expensive taste, and from rags to riches, the Whitmore transformation followed me everywhere. It was during this media frenzy that I first noticed the locked drawers in Marcus's home office. When I mentioned needing a pen, he quickly directed me to another room, instead of the obvious desk drawer right in front of us. The late-night phone calls started around the same time. Marcus would step onto the terrace or into his office, speaking in low tones I couldn't quite hear. When I asked about them, he'd kiss my forehead and say, "Just business, darling. Nothing that can't wait until morning, but if it could wait until morning, why take the calls at midnight?" 3 months into our marriage, I stood in our walk-in closet, a room larger than my old apartment, surrounded by designer clothes I'd never chosen, and jewelry worth more than most people's houses. Everything was beautiful, perfect, and expensive. Everything except the growing knot in my stomach. I loved Marcus. That hadn't changed. When he smiled at me over morning coffee, when he listened to my thoughts about books or current events, when he held me close during thunderstorms, those moments were real. But increasingly, I felt like I was living in a beautiful cage, admired and protected but somehow separate from the world I'd known. The woman in the mirror wore clothes that cost thousands, carried bags that required waiting lists, lived in a home featured in architectural magazines, but her eyes looked uncertain, almost lost. "You're overthinking," I said in my reflection. This is what happiness looks like. But was it? Or was I so dazzled by the luxury that I was missing something important? The locked drawers bothered me more than they should have. The midnight calls felt secretive in a way that business calls shouldn't. And sometimes, when Marcus thought I wasn't looking, I caught expressions on his face that seemed almost calculating. I pushed the thoughts away. This was my husband, the man who'd seen me when I felt invisible. Whatever secrets he had were probably just the normal complications of running a billion-dollar empire. I had no idea how wrong I was. The charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum was everything I dreamed such events would be. Crystal chandeliers casting golden light over priceless art, women in gowns that cost more than cars, men whose handshakes could move markets. Marcus moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his hand warm on my back as he introduced me to senators, celebrities, and CEOs, whose names I recognized from headlines. "Clara's the brilliant analyst who saved the Henderson deal," he'd say, and I'd smile and make small talk about market trends, while internally marveling at how surreal my life had become. But as the evening wore on, something felt off. The conversations were polished but empty, full of carefully crafted phrases that said nothing. When Marcus stepped away to speak with the defense contractor, I found myself alone with Senator Richardson's wife, who looked through me as if I were furniture. "You're very lucky," she said finally, her tone suggesting luck was the only explanation for my presence. "I prefer to think we found each other," I replied. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, darling, men like Marcus Whitmore don't find women like you. They collect them." The words stung more than they should have. When Marcus returned, sliding his arm around my waist, I felt the warmth of his touch, but also the weight of being displayed, shown off like another acquisition. Later, in the car ride home, I watched the city lights blur past our window. "Do you ever feel like we're performing?" I asked. Marcus looked up from his phone. "What do you mean?" "Tonight. All those people, all those conversations that weren't really conversations. It felt like theater." He was quiet for a moment. "That's just how these events are, Clara. It's business disguised as socializing. But we're not in business. We're supposed to be real." He reached for my hand. "We are real. Everything else is just necessary." But his answer felt rehearsed, like another performance. The next morning, Marcus left early for a breakfast meeting with investors. I wandered through our penthouse, still feeling unsettled from the previous night. The space was beautiful, but felt more like a museum than a home, everything perfectly arranged, nothing out of place, nothing that revealed who we really were. I found myself in Marcus's study, a room I rarely entered. It was his sanctuary, filled with first-edition books, awards from business magazines, and photographs of him with world leaders. The mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface clear except for a single laptop that had been left open. I shouldn't have looked. I knew that even as I approached the desk. But the screen was active, displaying what looked like a video conference that had recently ended. The application was still running, and at the top of the screen, I saw words that made my blood run cold. Project Eden Phase 3 Implementation. My finger hovered over the trackpad. This was Marcus's private business. I had no right to pry. But something about those words, Project Eden, sent a chill down my spine. I clicked. The screen filled with documents I didn't understand at first. Agricultural reports, satellite imagery, chemical formulations. But as I scrolled through the files, patterns emerged that made my stomach turn. Test sites in developing countries, crop failure rates, population displacement statistics. One document was titled Controlled Famine Scenarios. Another showed profit projections based on artificial scarcity implementation. A third contained communications with defense contractors about food security as leverage. My hands shook as I read email after email discussing Project Eden as if it were just another business venture. But this wasn't business. This was weaponizing hunger itself. Clara? I spun around to find Marcus standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. How long had he been watching me? I was looking for a pen, I said weakly, knowing how pathetic the excuse sounded. His eyes moved to the laptop screen, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly, but something colder, more calculating. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked quietly. The question hung between us like a blade. Marcus walked slowly into the study, his movements controlled and deliberate. He reached past me and closed the laptop with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "That's confidential business information, Clara." "Business information about starving people?" The words tumbled out before I could stop them. "Marcus, what is Project Eden?" He turned away from me, walking to the window that overlooked Central Park. For a long moment he said nothing, and I watched his reflection in the glass, the set of his shoulders, the tension in his jaw. "It's complicated," he said finally. "Complicated how?" "Because what I saw looked like... You saw fragments of something you don't understand." His voice was sharper now, cutting through my words. "Documents taken out of context, reports that don't tell the full story, then tell me the full story." He turned back to me, and for a moment, I saw something vulnerable in his eyes. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Some things are better left alone, Clara. Trust me on this." "Trust you?" I stepped closer, searching his face for the man I'd married. "Marcus, if this is legitimate business, why can't you explain it? Why do I feel like I've stumbled onto something terrible? Because you're letting your imagination run away with you." His tone was gentle now, almost patronizing. "You're not used to the scale of what I do, the complexity of global business. What looks frightening to you is just another day at the office for me." The dismissal stung worse than anger would have. He was treating me like a child who'd wandered into adult conversations. "Don't do that," I said quietly. "Don't make me feel stupid for being concerned. I'm not trying to make you feel stupid." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd learned meant he was frustrated. "I'm trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" "From knowing what my husband does for a living? From worrying about things that aren't your concern." The words hit me like a slap. "Not my concern? Marcus, I'm your wife, your business, your life. It's all my concern now, is it?" He moved closer, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, a hardness that made me take a step back. "Because 3 months ago, you were worried about making rent. Now you're questioning billion-dollar operations you couldn't possibly understand. So I should just smile and look pretty while you do what? Whatever Project Eden is. You should trust that I know what I'm doing, and you should trust that I'm smart enough to understand if you just explain it to me." We stared at each other across the study, and I felt the distance between us growing with each passing second. This wasn't the man who'd held me during thunderstorms, who'd made me coffee every morning, who'd promised to see me clearly always. "Some doors shouldn't be opened, Clara." His voice was quiet now, almost sad. "Some knowledge changes everything. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you." He moved to his desk, straightening papers that were already perfectly aligned. "There are aspects of my business that are classified that involve national security, that could put you in danger if you knew too much." "National security?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Marcus, what exactly do you do?" "I solve problems," he said simply. "Big problems that require complex solutions." The question hung in the air between us. Marcus's face went completely blank, and for a moment, I saw not my husband but the billionaire CEO, who could destroy companies with a phone call. "You need to stop digging, Clara, for both our sakes." That night, we went through the motions of normalcy. Marcus made dinner, pasta with the sauce I loved, and we ate while discussing safe topics like the weather and weekend plans. But underneath the ordinary conversation, I felt the weight of everything unsaid. As we got ready for bed, I watched him in the bathroom mirror. He looked tired, older somehow, as if our confrontation had aged him. When he caught me staring, he attempted a smile. "We're okay," he said, but it sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. Are we? He turned to face me fully. Clara, I love you. That hasn't changed, will never change. But there are parts of my life that existed long before you, commitments I made that I can't simply walk away from. What kind of commitments? The kind that keeps people safe. He reached for my hands. I know how this looks, how it feels, but sometimes doing the right thing requires methods that seem wrong from the outside. I wanted to believe him. Looking into his eyes, I could see the man I'd fallen in love with, the one who'd seen me when I felt invisible, who'd made me feel like I mattered. But I could also see shadows there, secrets that seemed to be eating at him from the inside. I need time to think, I said finally. He nodded, kissing my forehead gently. Take all the time you need. Just, please don't do anything that might put you in danger. As I lay awake that night, listening to his steady breathing beside me, I wondered, was he protecting me from the truth, or was the truth something that needed protecting from me? The next morning, Marcus left for a week-long business trip to Geneva. He kissed me goodbye at the door, holding me a moment longer than usual. I'll call you every day, he promised. Be safe, I replied, though I wasn't sure which of us needed safety more. As his car disappeared down the street, I stood in our penthouse surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt like a prison. The locked drawers in his study seemed to mock me. The laptop that held Project Eden's secrets sat just feet away, password protected and forbidden. I had a choice to make. I could trust my husband's request to leave things alone, to believe that his secrets were for my protection, or I could demand answers, even if those answers might destroy everything we'd built together. At this point, what would you do? Trust your partner's silence or demand answers? Tell me in the comments below, because the choice I made next would change everything, not just for Marcus and me, but for thousands of people I'd never met. The truth I was about to learn was far worse than I could have imagined. With Marcus in Geneva, I found myself with time I hadn't had in months. The penthouse felt too quiet, too full of unanswered questions, so I decided to do something I'd been meaning to do since our wedding: visit the Whitmore Foundation. Marcus had mentioned it in passing during our early conversations, describing it as his way of giving back. Food security initiatives, he'd said, making sure no one goes hungry. At the time, it had made me fall for him even more, a billionaire who cared about feeding the world. The foundation occupied 3 floors of a gleaming building in Midtown. As I walked through the lobby, I felt a surge of pride. This was my husband's legacy, his way of using wealth for good. The receptionist recognized my name immediately. Mrs. Whitmore, what an honor. Would you like a tour? I'd love one, I said, genuinely excited to see Marcus's humanitarian work firsthand. Sarah, the program director, led me through offices filled with dedicated staff working on laptops, walls covered with maps marking project locations across Africa, Asia, and South America. Everything looked exactly as I'd expected: professional, purposeful, important. Your husband is remarkable, Sarah said as we walked. The scope of what we're accomplishing is unprecedented. We're literally changing how the world thinks about food distribution. Tell me about the current projects, I said, pulling out my phone to take notes. I wanted to surprise Marcus with my knowledge when he returned. Well, Project Eden is our flagship initiative, Sarah began, and my blood went cold. We're working with agricultural communities in 12 countries to implement new farming technologies. The results have been transformative. I forced my voice to remain steady. Transformative how? Crop yields have increased dramatically in test areas. We're proving that with the right intervention, we can solve hunger in our lifetime. But as she spoke, fragments of what I'd seen on Marcus's laptop flashed through my mind. The same project name, the same countries, but described in very different terms. Could I see some of the data? I asked, trying to sound casually interested rather than desperately suspicious. Sarah's face lit up. Of course. We're so proud of our transparency. Everything we do is documented. She led me to a conference room where she pulled up presentation slides on a large screen. The images showed thriving farms, smiling families, and abundant harvests. The statistics were impressive. Crop yields up 300%, malnutrition rates dropping, communities flourishing. But something was wrong. The satellite coordinates on the slides didn't match the locations I'd seen in Marcus's files. The timeline was different too. These projects showed success over the past 2 years, while Marcus's documents referenced Phase 3 implementation starting just 6 months ago. These are beautiful results, I said carefully. Are these the same test sites mentioned in the Phase 3 reports? Sarah looked confused. Phase 3? I'm not familiar with that designation. We use different project codes here. My heart started racing. Could you show me the raw data, the actual field reports from these locations? I'd love to, but those are stored in our secure database. I'd need authorization from Mr. Whitmore to access the detailed files. I'm his wife, I said, trying to keep desperation out of my voice. Of course, but company policy requires direct authorization for sensitive data, even for family members. I'm sure you understand. I did understand. I understood that there were 2 versions of Project Eden. The beautiful humanitarian initiative Sarah believed in, and something else entirely that Marcus kept locked away. Could I get contact information for some of the communities you're working with? I asked. I'd love to hear their stories directly. Sarah hesitated. That's complicated. Many of these communities are in remote areas with limited communication infrastructure. We typically coordinate through local government liaisons. Every answer raised more questions. Every explanation felt rehearsed, sanitized. As Sarah continued the tour, showing me more success stories and glowing testimonials, I felt sick. Either she was lying to me, or she was being lied to herself. When I left the foundation 2 hours later, I had a folder full of beautiful brochures and a head full of terrible suspicions. The Project Eden that Sarah showed me was everything Marcus had claimed. A humanitarian triumph, but it wasn't the same Project Eden I'd glimpsed on his laptop. I made it 3 blocks before I had to stop and lean against a building, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. The pieces were falling into place in a way that made me want to scream. Marcus wasn't just hiding Project Eden from me, he was hiding it from his own foundation. The humanitarian work Sarah had shown me was real. But it was a cover for something else entirely. The smiling families, the thriving crops, the success stories. They were all true, but they weren't the whole truth. I thought about the documents I'd seen. Controlled famine scenarios, artificial scarcity implementation, food security as leverage. Those weren't the words of a man trying to feed the hungry. They were the words of someone weaponizing hunger itself. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Missing you. Geneva meetings going well. Can't wait to come home to my beautiful wife. I stared at the message until the words blurred. This was the man who'd held me when I cried about world suffering, who'd donated millions to charity, who'd promised to see me clearly, always. But he'd been lying to me from the beginning. Not just about Project Eden, but about who he was, what he did, what he was capable of. Every kiss, every tender moment, every declaration of love. How much of it had been real, and how much had been performance. I deleted his message without responding, and walked home through Central Park, past joggers and families and people living normal lives where the person they loved most wasn't potentially a monster. By the time I reached our penthouse, my heartbreak had crystallized into something harder, determination. Marcus returned from Geneva 3 days early, surprising me as I sat in the living room with my laptop, researching everything I could find about Whitmore Industries' international projects. I'd spent 72 hours going down rabbit holes of corporate filings, news reports, and academic papers about food security. Clara? He stood in the doorway, still in his travel clothes, looking genuinely happy to see me. I thought I'd surprise you. I closed my laptop slowly, my heart hammering. How was Geneva? productive. He moved toward me, but something in my posture made him stop. Is everything all right? I visited your foundation while you were gone. The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. The warmth in his eyes flickered, replaced by something more guarded. Did you? What did you think? I thought it was beautiful. Sarah gave me a wonderful tour, showed me all the success stories from Project Eden. He sat down across from me, his movements careful and controlled. I'm glad you got to see the work we're doing. The work you're doing. I leaned forward. Marcus, I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Right now. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Outside, the city hummed with life, but inside our penthouse, everything felt suspended, waiting. What truth do you think you need to hear? He asked quietly. The truth about what Project Eden really is. Marcus stared at me for what felt like an eternity. I watched emotions flicker across his face. Calculation, resignation, something that might have been relief. Finally, he stood and walked to the window, his back to me. How much do you know? He asked. I know there are two versions of Project Eden. The humanitarian one your foundation believes in, and something else. Something involving controlled famines and artificial scarcity. His shoulders sagged slightly. Clara, I know you've been lying to me, to everyone. I know that whatever you're really doing, it's not about feeding hungry people, it's about controlling them. He turned around, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before, defeat. You're right, he said simply. The admission hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting it. Hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way that all my research and suspicions hadn't. Project Eden is a food control system, he continued, his voice flat and emotionless. It's designed to create dependency, to give certain parties leverage over developing nations by controlling their food supply. I felt like I was drowning. And you're in charge of it. I oversee the implementation, yes. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Marcus, why would you do something like that? He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city lights. When he spoke again, his voice was different, younger somehow, more vulnerable. Because I inherited it. What do you mean, inherited it? He turned back to me, and I saw pain in his eyes that I'd never noticed before. Project Eden wasn't my idea, Clara. It wasn't my choice. It was my father's legacy, and when he died, it became mine. That's not an answer. You could have stopped it, could I? He laughed bitterly. You think I haven't tried? Marcus moved to his desk and pulled out a key I'd never seen before. He unlocked the bottom drawer, one of the ones I'd noticed was always secured, and withdrew a thick folder. My father started Project Eden 20 years ago, he said, handing me the folder. It began as exactly what you saw at the foundation, a legitimate humanitarian effort. But somewhere along the way, it was co-opted by people with different agendas. I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were documents dating back decades, correspondence between Marcus's father and various government agencies, contracts with organizations I'd never heard of. When my father died, I inherited more than just Whitmore Industries, Marcus continued. I inherited obligations, contracts, relationships with people who don't take no for an answer. What kind of people? The kind who make it clear that cooperation isn't optional. He sat down heavily. Clara, do you think I wanted this? Do you think I chose to spend my life implementing a system I morally oppose? I looked up from the documents. Then why do it? Because the alternative is worse. His voice was barely audible. They made that very clear when I first tried to shut it down. The threats weren't just against me, they were against everyone I cared about. What threats? The kind that ends careers, destroys lives, and makes people disappear. He met my eyes. The kind that would target my wife if they thought she knew too much. The room spun around me as the implications hit home. Marcus, I've been trying to protect you, Clara. From them, from this, from the truth that could get us both killed. I sat in stunned silence, the folder heavy in my lap. Everything I thought I knew had shifted again. Marcus wasn't the villain I'd imagined. He was a prisoner in a cage made of his father's choices and other people's threats. But he was still implementing Project Eden, still overseeing a system that would cause suffering on an unimaginable scale. How many people will die because of this? I asked. I don't know. His honesty was brutal. I've been trying to minimize the damage, to find ways to sabotage the worst aspects without getting caught. But Clara, I'm one man against an organization that's been planning this for decades. So you just go along with it? I will try to survive it. He knelt in front of my chair, taking my hands. Every day I look for a way out. Every day I hope I'll find something that will let me destroy this without destroying us. I looked into his eyes and saw the man I'd fallen in love with, but also saw the weight he'd been carrying alone. The late-night calls, the locked drawers, the careful distance he'd maintained from certain topics. It all made sense now. Why didn't you tell me? I whispered. Because I love you too much to make you complicit, and because I was terrified you'd leave. I was torn between wanting to comfort him and wanting to scream. He'd lied to me, yes, but to protect me. He was implementing something terrible, yes, but under threat. What do you do when the person you love is both victim and perpetrator? Marcus stood and walked to the wall where a portrait of his father hung, a distinguished man in an expensive suit, with the same gray eyes but a harder expression. I'd always assumed it was a tribute to a beloved parent. Now I wondered if it was something else entirely. Richard Whitmore was a brilliant man, Marcus began, his voice hollow. Brilliant and ruthless. He built Whitmore Industries from nothing, but he didn't build it cleanly. He pulled down another folder from a high shelf, this one even thicker than the first. When I was growing up, I thought my father was a hero. He'd take me to ribbon cuttings for hospitals he'd funded, schools he'd built, water treatment plants that bore our family name. I was so proud to be his son. Marcus opened the folder, revealing photographs from his childhood. A young boy standing beside his father at various charity events, both of them smiling for cameras. But underneath the photos were documents that told a different story. I didn't learn the truth until after his funeral, Marcus continued. The lawyers sat me down and explained my full inheritance. Hospitals were real, but they were also money laundering operations. The schools existed, but they were covered for arms dealing. The water treatment plants were legitimate, but they were built with profits from human trafficking. I felt sick reading the documents. Shell companies within shell companies, charitable foundations that existed only on paper, humanitarian projects that served as fronts for weapons smuggling and worse. Your father was involved in human trafficking, I whispered. Among other things. Marcus's voice was bitter. He called it diversified revenue streams. The legitimate businesses provided cover for the illegal ones, and the illegal ones funded the legitimate charitable work. It was a perfect system. He could be a philanthropist and a criminal simultaneously. And Project Eden started as a genuine effort to solve world hunger. My father believed in it, at least initially, but when certain government agencies realized the potential for weaponization, they made him an offer he couldn't refuse. The project continued under the humanitarian banner, but its true purpose changed completely. Marcus closed the folder. When he died, I inherited everything. The legitimate businesses, the criminal enterprises, and all the obligations that came with them. How many people know? I asked, still reeling from the scope of what Marcus had revealed. About the full extent? Maybe a dozen. Most of the employees at the foundation, at our legitimate businesses, they're good people doing good work. They have no idea what else exists. Marcus moved to his computer and pulled up a complex organizational chart that looked like a spider web. This is the real structure of what I inherited. Every legitimate charity has a shadow organization. Every humanitarian project has a darker twin. I studied the chart, trying to follow the connections. The Whitmore Foundation was just one node in a vast network. There were medical research facilities that conducted illegal human experiments, educational programs that recruited children for exploitation, environmental initiatives that served as covers for illegal mining operations. The people running these shadow operations, they're not employees, Marcus explained. They're partners, stakeholders, people with their own agendas who use our infrastructure for their purposes. When my father died, they made it clear that the arrangement would continue. What did they say exactly? Marcus was quiet for a moment. They showed me photographs. Of you, actually, from before we'd even met. They'd been watching me for months, documenting everyone I cared about. They knew about my college girlfriend who died in a car accident that suddenly seemed less accidental. They knew about my business partner who'd committed suicide after his family received certain threats. The room felt cold suddenly. They killed those people? They didn't have to say it explicitly. The message was clear. Cooperation ensures everyone's safety. Resistance has consequences, so you just agreed? I tried to fight it at first. Hired investigators, lawyers, even considered going to the FBI. But every avenue I explored led back to the same conclusion. These people have connections everywhere. Government agencies, law enforcement, international organizations. Fighting them isn't just dangerous, it's futile. There has to be something you can do. I've been trying for 5 years, Clara. Small acts of sabotage, redirecting funds, warning potential victims when I can. But it's like trying to stop an avalanche with a teaspoon. Marcus sat down across from me again, and I could see the exhaustion in every line of his face. This wasn't just about business or even survival. It was about a man trying to find redemption in an impossible situation. "Do you know why I fell in love with you?" he asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. "Marcus, it was that first day, when you talked about numbers telling stories. You saw patterns, connections, truth hidden in data. But more than that, you cared about the people behind the numbers. When you analyzed the Henderson Industries deal, you weren't just looking at profit margins. You were thinking about the workers who would be affected, the communities that depended on those jobs." His voice grew softer. I'd spent 5 years surrounded by people who saw human suffering as acceptable collateral damage. Then I met someone who saw human dignity as the only thing that mattered. "So you married me to feel better about yourself?" "I married you because you made me remember who I wanted to be." He leaned forward. "Clara, every day with you has been a reminder that there's still good in the world worth fighting for. You've given me hope that maybe somehow I can find a way out of this." "What kind of way out?" "I don't know yet. But I've been documenting everything, building a case, looking for leverage. The people who control these operations, they're not untouchable. They have weaknesses, secrets of their own. If I can find the right pressure point, you could bring them down, or get us both killed trying." He reached for my hands again. "That's why I didn't tell you. Not because I don't trust you, but because I couldn't bear the thought of dragging you into this darkness. You're the only pure thing in my life, Clara. The only thing that isn't tainted by my father's legacy." I looked at our joined hands, his scarred from years of carrying impossible burdens, mine soft from a life that had been protected from such harsh realities. I walked to the window and looked out at the Manhattan skyline. From our penthouse, the city looked perfect. Gleaming towers reaching toward the sky, each light representing dreams and ambitions and honest work. But I knew now that some of those lights belonged to the shadow organizations Marcus had described, that beauty and corruption could exist in the same space. "It's like this building," I said, pressing my palm against the glass. "From the outside, it looks solid, permanent, beautiful. But if the foundation is compromised, the whole thing comes down," Marcus finished. "That's exactly what my father built, a glass tower on a foundation of lies. And I've been trying to reinforce it from the inside without anyone noticing." "What happens if you stop trying?" "The tower falls anyway, but it takes innocent people with it. The legitimate charities, the real humanitarian work, the thousands of employees who have no idea what they're really part of, they all get destroyed." I understood now why he looked so tired, why he carried himself like a man bearing an impossible weight. He wasn't just trying to escape his father's legacy, He was trying to dismantle it without destroying everything good that had grown around it. "There's something else," he said quietly. "The reason I've been so careful, so paranoid about security." "What?" "They've been watching you since our engagement. Taking photos, documenting your routines, making sure I understand what I have to lose." The glass felt cold against my forehead. "They're watching me right now?" "Probably. Which is why this conversation is the most dangerous thing I've ever done." I closed my eyes and tried to process everything Marcus had told me. 6 hours ago, I thought my husband was a monster. Now I knew he was something more complicated. A good man trapped in an evil system, trying to find redemption while protecting the people he loved. But did that change anything? Did his noble intentions matter when the result was still suffering on a massive scale? Did his love for me excuse his participation in something that would cause famines, displacement, death? I thought about my parents, about the values they'd instilled in me. My father had always said that character was revealed not in easy moments, but in impossible ones. What did it say about my character that I was even considering staying with a man who was implementing Project Eden, regardless of his reasons? But then I thought about the Marcus I'd fallen in love with, the one who'd seen me when I felt invisible, who'd listened to my dreams and fears, who'd made me feel like I mattered. That man was real. His love for me was real. His anguish over his situation was real. Could I abandon him when he needed me most? Could I walk away from someone who was fighting a battle he couldn't win, carrying burdens he'd never chosen? Or would staying make me complicit in everything he was being forced to do? I opened my eyes and looked at Marcus, who was watching me with an expression of desperate hope mixed with resigned acceptance. He was prepared for me to leave. He expected it, maybe even thought he deserved it. "If I stay," I said slowly, "what does that make me?" "It makes you the bravest person I know, or the most naive. Clara, I won't blame you if you can't handle this. I won't blame you if you decide that loving me isn't worth the risk, the moral complexity, the danger. I'll understand if you need to walk away to protect yourself, your conscience, your future. And if I stay, then we figure out how to destroy this thing together. We find a way to bring down the people who killed my father's victims, who are threatening us now, who are planning to weaponize hunger itself. We use the access I have, the knowledge you bring, and we find a way to turn this glass tower into a weapon against the people who built it." I looked out at the city lights again, each one representing a choice, a life, a story that could be affected by what we decided in this room. The question wasn't whether I loved Marcus. I did, completely and irrevocably. The question was whether love was enough to justify what came next. I stood at that window for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The weight of the decision pressed down on me like a physical force. Walk away and preserve my conscience, but abandon the man I love to fight alone, or stay and become part of something that could either save thousands of lives or destroy us both. "Marcus," I said finally, turning back to face him, "if we do this, if we try to bring them down, what are our chances of success? Honestly, maybe 20%, and that's being optimistic. And our chances of survival if we fail?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Lower," I nodded, having expected that answer. "And if we do nothing? If we just continue as we have been?" Project Eden moves forward. Thousands of people die, and I spend the rest of my life knowing I could have tried to stop it, but chose safety instead. The choice crystallized in that moment. This wasn't really about Marcus or me, or our marriage. It was about the villages that would starve, the children who would die, the families that would be destroyed if we did nothing. My parents had raised me to believe that with privilege came responsibility. I'd married into more privilege than I'd ever imagined. Didn't that come with the responsibility to use it for good? "I'm staying," I said. Marcus's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, relief, fear, love. "Clara, you don't understand what you're agreeing to. These people don't just threaten, they follow through. If they discover what we're doing, then we make sure they don't discover it until it's too late." I moved away from the window and sat down across from him. You said you've been documenting everything. Show me what you have. Are you sure? Marcus, I've spent my entire career analyzing complex financial systems, finding patterns in data, uncovering discrepancies that others miss. You need someone who can see the connections, who can help you build a case that's bulletproof. You need me. He stared at me for a moment, then reached for his laptop. Once I show you this, there's no going back. You'll know everything, which makes you as much of a target as I am. I'm already a target just by being your wife. At least this way, I'm a target who can fight back. As Marcus opened file after file on his laptop, showing me 5 years' worth of carefully documented evidence, I watched his composure finally crack. His hands shook as he scrolled through photographs of villages that had been destroyed, families that had been displaced, children who had died because of projects he'd been forced to oversee. I tried to minimize the damage, he whispered, his voice breaking. Every decision, every authorization I was forced to sign, I looked for ways to reduce the impact. But Clara, people still died because of me. Families still lost everything because I wasn't brave enough to say no. Tears started falling down his face, the first time I'd ever seen him cry. This powerful, controlled man who commanded boardrooms and moved markets was breaking apart in front of me, and I realized he'd been carrying this guilt alone for years. I became everything I swore I'd never be, he continued, my father's son in the worst possible way. And the worst part is, I convinced myself I was protecting people by staying quiet, by going along with it. But I was really just protecting myself. I moved to sit beside him on the couch, pulling him into my arms. He collapsed against me, his whole body shaking with suppressed sobs. You were surviving, I said firmly. There's a difference between choosing evil and being forced into it, is there? Because the result is the same. No, it's not. I held him tighter. The result would be the same if you'd given up, if you'd stopped caring, if you'd embraced what they wanted you to become. But you didn't. You documented everything. You looked for ways to minimize harm. You never stopped fighting, even when fighting meant losing. I was so afraid you'd leave, he whispered against my shoulder. I'm not going anywhere. We're going to fix this, Marcus. Together. For the first time since I discovered Project Eden, I felt something other than fear and confusion. I felt purpose. We had work to do. Over the next 3 months, our penthouse became a war room. Marcus had been collecting evidence for years, but now we organized it systematically, building cases against each shadow organization, mapping connections between legitimate businesses and their criminal counterparts, identifying the key players who held the whole system together. I brought my analytical skills to bear on the financial records, tracing money flows that revealed the true scope of the operation. What we discovered was both more extensive and more vulnerable than either of us had realized. Look at this, I said one evening, pointing to a pattern I'd found in the accounting records. They're using the same shell company to launder money for 3 different operations. If we can prove that connection, we can bring down the entire Eastern European network, Marcus finished, leaning over my shoulder to study the screen. We started small, feeding anonymous tips to investigative journalists about minor discrepancies in charity filings. When those stories gained traction without triggering retaliation, we grew bolder. Marcus began using his access to redirect funds from shadow operations to legitimate humanitarian work, making the transfers look like routine budget adjustments. The first major breakthrough came when we discovered that Senator Richardson, the man whose wife had dismissed me at the charity gala, was taking payments from one of the arms dealing operations. Marcus had recordings of their conversations, financial records showing the transfers and documentation of weapons shipments that Richardson had helped facilitate. If we expose him, he'll take others down with him, Marcus said, as we reviewed the evidence. Politicians protect themselves by exposing their XO conspirators. Are you ready for that level of attention? Are you? I thought about the quiet life I'd left behind, the anonymity I'd lost when I married Marcus, the safety I was about to sacrifice completely. Yes, let's do it. We sent the Richardson files to 3 different news organizations simultaneously, along with enough supporting documentation to make the story bulletproof. Within a week, the senator had resigned and was facing federal charges. Within 2 weeks, he'd started naming names. The shadow empire Marcus had inherited was beginning to crack, and we were the ones holding the hammer. The social consequences came swiftly. As news of Richardson's arrest spread and investigations began into his associates, the wealthy elite who had welcomed us into their circles suddenly became unavailable. Charity galas we'd been invited to were mysteriously full. Business partners found reasons to postpone meetings indefinitely. Mrs. Whitmore, the wife of a defense contractor, said when she encountered me at a coffee shop, "I hope you and Marcus know what you're doing. Some stones are better left unturned." The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. We were no longer protected by our social status. We were marked as dangerous. But for every false friend we lost, we gained something more valuable: real allies. Investigative journalists who had been trying to expose these networks for years suddenly had access to insider information. FBI agents who had been building cases without sufficient evidence found themselves with treasure troves of documentation. International human rights organizations discovered they had a billionaire willing to fund their work against corruption. Marcus's transformation was remarkable to watch. The man who had carried guilt and fear for 5 years was becoming someone I'd never seen before: focused, determined, almost fearless. He used his business meetings to gather intelligence, his charity events to identify targets, his social connections to set traps for the people who had controlled him. "The arms-dealing network is almost completely exposed," he told me one evening, as we reviewed our progress. 3 more arrests this week, and they're all talking. What about Project Eden? That's the big one. We need to time it perfectly. Expose the whole operation simultaneously so they can't cover their tracks or eliminate evidence. We had identified 12 key figures who controlled Project Eden's implementation. If we could bring them down together, the entire system would collapse. But if we moved too early or missed even one of them, the survivors would disappear and rebuild elsewhere. "How much more time do we need?" I asked. 2 weeks. Maybe 3. We didn't have 3 weeks. The contrast between our old life and our new reality was stark. Where once we'd attended glittering charity galas in ballrooms filled with Manhattan's elite, we now met with refugee advocates in cramped offices, planning how to redirect funds from shadow operations to legitimate aid work. The champagne toasts and designer gowns were replaced by late-night strategy sessions and stacks of legal documents. Instead of posing for society photographers, we were scanning financial records and building cases that could save lives. But the most beautiful change was in the work itself. Every shadow operation we exposed freed up resources for genuine humanitarian efforts. The money that had been funding arms deals was redirected to build schools in communities that Project Eden had targeted for artificial famine. The funds that had supported human trafficking networks were channeled into medical clinics and clean water projects. Marcus showed me photographs from the field, children attending classes in schools built with money we'd liberated from weapons smugglers. Families drinking clean water from wells funded by redirected trafficking profits. Each image was proof that our work was making a real difference. "This is what my father's empire should have been," Marcus said, looking at a photo of a new hospital in Kenya. "This is what I want the Whitmore name to mean." The penthouse that had once felt like a beautiful prison was now our command center for justice. The wealth that had isolated us from the world was becoming a tool to change it. And the love that had brought us together was becoming the foundation for something larger than ourselves. 6 months after that night, when I discovered Project Eden, our lives had been completely transformed. The shadow empire that had controlled Marcus for 5 years was crumbling, piece by piece. Senator Richardson's testimony had led to the arrest of 2 defense contractors and a State Department official. The arms-dealing network had been completely dismantled, with $200 million in assets seized and redirected to legitimate humanitarian work. 3 human trafficking operations had been shut down, with their victims rescued and their perpetrators facing life sentences. But the most significant victory was personal. Marcus was no longer the haunted man I'd married. The guilt that had weighed him down was being replaced by purpose. The fear that had controlled his decisions was being overcome by determination. "I got a call from the village in Somalia," he told me one morning over coffee. "The one where we redirected the Project Eden funds. They want to name the new school after us." After us? The Clara and Marcus Whitmore School for Girls. They said it's for the people who chose to fight instead of looking away. I felt tears in my eyes. 6 months ago I'd been a billionaire's wife, living in luxury, while people suffered. Now I was part of something that was actively making the world better. "Are you ready for the final phase?" Marcus asked. I squeezed his hand. "Let's bring down Project Eden." The financial retaliation began 3 weeks after we exposed the Richardson network. Marcus's phone rang at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, his lawyer calling with news that froze my blood. "They've frozen our primary accounts," Marcus said after hanging up, his face pale. "Emergency injunction based on allegations of money laundering." I stared at him from across our breakfast table. "How much?" 80% of our liquid assets. They're claiming the funds are proceeds from criminal activity." The irony was bitter. We were being punished financially for exposing actual criminal activity, while the people we'd exposed had spent years profiting from it without consequence. But this was how the system protected itself, by making the cost of truth higher than the cost of silence. Within a month, the attacks escalated. Whitmore Industries lost 3 major contracts when irregularities were discovered in our bidding processes. Irregularities that had been planted by people with access to government databases. Our stock price plummeted as anonymous sources leaked false information about our financial stability. "We're hemorrhaging money," Marcus told me one evening as he reviewed the latest reports. "If this continues, we'll be bankrupt within 6 months." "Good," I said, surprising him. "Good. Marcus, this money was built on your father's crimes. Maybe losing it is part of the redemption process." He looked at me with something between admiration and disbelief. "Clara, we're talking about losing everything. The penthouse, the cars, the lifestyle you've gotten used to." "The lifestyle I never asked for," I corrected. "I fell in love with you when you were just Marcus buying me coffee. I can fall in love with you again when you're just Marcus trying to rebuild." But even as I said it, I felt the weight of what we were losing. Not just the luxury, but the security, the power to make change, the resources we'd been using to fight back. "There's something else," Marcus said quietly. "They're coming after you too." The character assassination began subtly. A gossip column mentioned my suspicious rise from nobody analyst to Billionaire's wife. A business magazine questioned whether I'd used insider information for personal gain. Social media accounts I'd never heard of started posting about my gold-digging past. But the real damage came from sources that seemed credible. A former colleague at Brennan and Associates gave an interview claiming I'd always been ambitious to the point of ruthlessness. My college roommate, whom I hadn't spoken to in years, told a reporter that I'd always been obsessed with money and status. "None of this is true," I said, reading the latest article that painted me as a calculating social climber who'd seduced Marcus for his fortune. "Truth doesn't matter," Marcus replied grimly. "They're creating a narrative that makes you the villain, so that when we're destroyed, people will think we deserved it." The attacks became more personal. Photographers followed me to the grocery store, hoping to catch unflattering photos. Reporters called my old neighbors, asking about my real motivations for marrying Marcus. Someone leaked my college transcripts, highlighting the financial aid I'd received and suggesting I'd been desperate for wealth since childhood. The worst part was seeing how the narrative affected people who should have known better. Former friends stopped returning my calls, charity organizations quietly removed me from their boards. Even the barista at our favorite coffee shop looked at me differently, as if I were a stranger wearing a familiar face. "They're trying to isolate us," Marcus observed, "make us feel like we have no allies, no support system. Are they succeeding?" He squeezed my hand. "Not as long as we have each other." But I could see the strain in his eyes. Fighting a shadow empire was hard enough without feeling like the whole world was against us. The betrayals hurt more than the public attacks because they came from people we'd trusted. The first was Jonathan Hartwell, Marcus's business partner for over a decade, who called an emergency board meeting to discuss Marcus's recent erratic behavior and its impact on company stability. "He's trying to force me out," Marcus told me after the meeting. 20 years of friendship, and he's willing to destroy me to protect his own interests. What did he say exactly? That my crusade against respected business leaders was damaging Whitmore Industries' reputation, that the board needed to consider whether I was still fit to lead the company. The vote was close, 5-4 in Marcus's favor, but the damage was done. Half the board now saw him as a liability rather than a leader. Then came the social betrayals. Victoria Ashford, who'd been my closest friend among the Manhattan elite, gave an interview to Vanity Fair describing me as always a bit calculating and suggesting that my marriage to Marcus had been suspiciously convenient timing. "We had lunch together last month," I said, staring at the article. "She told me how proud she was of the work we were doing." "People say what they think you want to hear," Marcus replied. "But when there's pressure, they show their true colors." The most painful betrayal came from Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the director of a children's hospital that Marcus had funded for years. She returned a $5 million donation we'd made just weeks earlier, citing concerns about the source of the funds. "Those children needed that money," I said, feeling sick. "She's protecting the hospital," Marcus said, but I could see how much it hurt him. If they're associated with us now, they might lose other donors. "So we're toxic, we're inconvenient, and in their world, that's the same thing." But not everyone abandoned us. Sarah from the foundation called to offer her resignation in protest of the board's treatment of Marcus. 3 investigative journalists reached out with offers to help expose the people attacking us. And surprisingly, my old boss from Brennan and Associates sent a private message, "I know who you really are. Don't let them change that." As our old world crumbled around us, a new one began to emerge. The people who reached out weren't wealthy or powerful, but they were genuine in ways our former friends had never been. Maria Santos, a human rights lawyer who'd been fighting corruption in Central America for decades, became our most valuable ally. She understood the networks we were exposing, because she'd been battling them from the ground level. "You're doing what I've dreamed of for 20 years, she told us during a clandestine meeting in a Queens diner. "Having someone with inside access, with documentation, with resources, it changes everything." Through Maria, we connected with a network of activists, journalists, and law enforcement officials who'd been fighting the same battles we were, just with fewer resources. They taught us operational security, helped us understand legal strategies, and most importantly, reminded us why the fight mattered. "Look at this," Maria said, showing us photos from a village in Guatemala where one of the shadow operations had been shut down. "These families have clean water now because of what you exposed. These children are going to school because you redirected those funds. For every false friend we lost, we gained 10 real allies. For every door that closed in Manhattan's elite circles, 3 opened in communities that actually needed our help. This is what real wealth looks like," I told Marcus as we reviewed the impact reports. "Not bank accounts, but lives changed. 6 months into our fight, we'd lost almost everything that had defined our old life. The penthouse was gone, sold to pay legal fees and fund our operations. The designer clothes, the expensive cars, the exclusive memberships, all liquidated or abandoned. We moved into a modest apartment in Brooklyn, the kind of place I might have lived if I'd never met Marcus. But something strange happened. As our material wealth disappeared, I felt lighter, more myself than I had in years. "Do you miss it?" Marcus asked one evening as we ate takeout Chinese food on our second-hand couch. "The money? Sometimes. The security it provided, the ability to help people on a large scale." I considered the question seriously, but I don't miss feeling like I was living someone else's life, even if we never get it back, even if this is our life now. I looked around our small apartment, at the stack of legal documents on our kitchen table, the laptop where we coordinated with allies around the world, the photos on our refrigerator from communities we'd helped. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. "Marcus, wealth can vanish overnight. We've learned that the hard way. But integrity, that's something no one can take from you unless you give it away. And if we lose everything, if they destroy us completely, then we'll have lost everything while fighting for something that mattered. That's not defeat, that's honor." The truth was, I'd discovered something about myself through this process. I was stronger than I'd known, more resilient than I'd imagined. The woman who'd been intimidated by locked drawers and midnight phone calls had become someone who could stare down billionaires and government officials without flinching. "Besides," I added, smiling at him, "we're not done yet. They think they've broken us, but they've just made us more dangerous." "How so?" "Because now we have nothing left to lose." The final phase of our plan was the most dangerous yet. We'd spent months building cases, gathering allies, and exposing the smaller networks. But Project Eden itself, the heart of the operation, remained intact. Taking it down would require everything we'd learned and everyone we'd recruited. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked as we prepared for what we both knew might be our last stand. I've never been more ready for anything in my life. Looking back now, I realize that our journey wasn't really about exposing corruption or bringing down a shadow empire. It was about discovering what we were made of when everything else was stripped away. It was about learning that love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing to fight together when the world tries to tear you apart. If you believe that relationships need truth, not perfection, hit that like button and subscribe to Rich Billionaire Romance Stories. Share this with someone who needs to hear that real love isn't about what you have, it's about what you're willing to sacrifice for each other. Because the final battle was about to begin, and we would need every ally we could find. 2 years after we brought down Project Eden, I found myself standing in front of a mirror in our Brooklyn apartment, getting ready for what had become our weekly tradition. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who'd once lived in a Manhattan penthouse, older perhaps, with lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult choices, but also more at peace than I'd ever been. The final battle had been brutal. Exposing Project Eden had triggered a cascade of investigations that reached into government agencies, international corporations, and criminal networks spanning 6 continents. Marcus and I had testified before Congress, survived 2 assassination attempts, and watched as dozens of powerful people were arrested and convicted. The shadow empire was gone, but the victory had come at a cost. Whitmore Industries had been dissolved, its assets seized and redistributed to victims of the various criminal enterprises. Marcus's personal fortune had been reduced to almost nothing after legal fees, restitution payments, and the voluntary return of money traced to illegal activities. But we were alive. We were together. And for the first time since I'd discovered those documents in Marcus's study, we were truly free. "Ready?" Marcus called from the kitchen, where he was making coffee in our small but functional space. "Almost," I replied, fastening the simple gold necklace he'd given me for our 2nd anniversary, not because it was expensive, but because it reminded us both that the most valuable things couldn't be bought. The cafe looked exactly the same as it had 3 years ago when Marcus and I had first sat across from each other. Two strangers sharing coffee and conversation. The same wobbling tables, the same barista who knew everyone's order, the same comfortable chaos of a place where real people lived real lives. "Table for two?" the hostess asked, not recognizing us despite all the media coverage our story had received. "Actually," Marcus said, pointing to a corner table, "could we sit there? It's where we had our first date." As we settled into the familiar seats, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with endings and everything to do with beginnings. This was where we'd fallen in love, when Marcus was just a man who made me laugh, and I was just a woman who saw patterns in numbers. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked as we waited for our coffee. "Everything we lost, everything we went through?" Marcus reached across the table and took my hand, the same gesture he'd made in this exact spot years ago, but now it carried the weight of everything we'd survived together. "Never," he said without hesitation. "Clara, we lost money, status, the approval of people who never really knew us. But we found something more valuable." "What's that?" "We found out who we really are when everything else is stripped away. And I like who we are." I looked around the cafe at the other customers. A young mother feeding her toddler, an elderly man reading a newspaper, and a couple of college students studying for exams. These were the people we'd fought for, though they'd never know it. These were the lives that mattered more than any bank account. "You know what I learned?" I said, stirring my coffee thoughtfully. "Integrity isn't something you can buy or sell. It's not an asset that appreciates or depreciates based on market conditions. It's the one thing that's truly yours, no matter what anyone else does. Even when it costs you everything, especially then." I met his eyes. "Marcus, we could have stayed silent. We could have kept the money, the lifestyle, the social status. But we would have lost ourselves in the process. And what good is having billions if you can't look at yourself in the mirror? The people we used to socialize with, they still have their billions, and they still can't sleep at night. They still jump at shadows, still wonder who they can trust, still live in fear that their secrets will be exposed. That's not wealth, that's poverty of the soul." "I used to think love was a feeling," I continued, watching Marcus's face as he listened. "Something that happened to you, like catching a cold or winning the lottery. But I know now that love is a choice you make every single day, even on the hard days, especially on the hard days." I smiled, remembering the nights we'd spent in safe houses, the mornings we'd woken up to death threats, the moments when giving up would have been so much easier than fighting on. Anyone can love someone when life is perfect, but choosing to love someone when the world is falling apart, that's when you discover what love really means. And what does it mean? It means seeing someone at their worst and choosing to believe in their best. It means standing together when everyone else walks away. It means building something real in a world full of beautiful lies. Marcus squeezed my hand. It means finding someone who makes you want to be better than you are, and then doing the work to become that person every single day. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the world go by outside the cafe windows. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that their ordinariness was extraordinary. "So what is true wealth?" Marcus asked, echoing a conversation we'd had many times over the past 2 years. "This," I said, gesturing between us. "Sitting in a cafe with someone you trust completely, knowing that you've both chosen truth over comfort, integrity over security. It's waking up every morning without wondering what secrets your partner is hiding. It's going to sleep every night knowing that you've lived according to your values, even when it was difficult. Even when we're eating ramen noodles instead of caviar, especially then." I laughed. "Marcus, do you know what I treasure most about our life now?" "What?" "The fact that there are no locked drawers in our apartment, no midnight phone calls that you can't explain, no documents hidden in safes. Everything between us is open, honest, real. That's worth more than any fortune. That's the only fortune that matters." I raised my coffee cup in a mock toast. to be broken happy instead of rich and miserable. To choose love over fear, he replied, clinking his cup against mine. To build something real on the ruins of something false. As we left the cafe that afternoon, walking hand in hand down the same street where our love story had begun, I reflected on the journey that had brought us full circle. We'd started as strangers who found each other in an elevator, fell in love over coffee and conversation, built a life together on a foundation of lies, and then tore it all down to build something true. The woman who'd once been dazzled by penthouse views and designer gowns now found joy in subway rides and second-hand books. The man who'd once commanded billion-dollar empires now taught business ethics at a community college and found more satisfaction in his students' success than he'd ever found in corporate profits. We'd learned that the most dangerous secrets aren't the ones that could destroy your marriage. They're the ones that could destroy your soul. And we'd discovered that the greatest love stories aren't about finding someone perfect, but about choosing to fight for something real. Sometimes the best way to find your happily ever after is to lose everything else first.